know you heard me on the radio flexing. She loved the sound of my voice, it's the best thing. Daydreaming of the jazz all day. Pick up the phone late night with Larry K. I know you heard me on the radio flexing. She loved the sound of my voice, it's the best thing. Daydreaming of the jazz all day. Pick up the phone late night with Larry K.
Night Watch listeners and Scarlet Knights fans, welcome to another episode of Night Watch with Larry K. And we have another treat for you with Dave Anderson joining me for the Sealing of Coach Schiano Part 2. We're going to delve into 2.0 and just generally some other topics of interest that will tell us and give us a roadmap as to Dave's opinion, my opinion, of how far Rutgers football and this program can really go under head coach Greg Schiano's tutelage and his control, for better or worse. I think mostly it's been better, but there's a lot to dissect here. So, Dave, let's start by setting the stage. Greg Schiano leaves, goes off to coach Tampa Bay Buccaneers, winds up going eventually to be Ohio State's defensive coordinator, finds all these, paths, comes back to a lot of fanfare from most people, some concerns and considerations to some remembering 1.0, but with the tumultuous times that Rutgers went through without him, I think some forget some of the objective criticism or concerns that could have occurred. But Greg returns, and he has said now he's on record, no more speculation. He wanted Rutgers to be in the Big Ten. He thought that was the right fit. That was the goal. He thought there was some doubt as to whether Rutgers would ever get to the Big Ten once Nebraska leapfrogged us. He takes what he called the way out, going to Tampa. I personally think, and I take Greg at his word, but I think there might have been some conversation in there, maybe with some mentors like Bill Belichick, some thought that you can't pass up a job that only 32 guys at one time ever get to have. You never know what could be. And if you turn it down, I know Greg says that who knows if he had stayed, who knows what could have happened with the program. But I also think that other thing would be aching, into him too, which is what could have happened if I went to the NFL. That has now kind of run its course, and he's back. But he comes back, Dave. And Rutgers is now in the Big Ten. And not only that, but now they find themselves in another expanded Big Ten with conference realignment. We saw what he could do in 1.0 in the Big East and what that entailed. And there were some limits and some victories in that realm. With respect to realignment, and I want you to address it on two levels. One, the new Big Ten and what that means, the competition we're going up against, and the expanded Big Ten, what that means. But also the expanded, college football playoff. It kind of diminishes some of the moral victories you might get with certain bowl games, or does it? And it gives Rutgers an opportunity to get to the playoff. I don't know if it necessarily gives Rutgers or any other team an opportunity to win a title. I mean, I think that's debatable, but I want your take on it. With Greg coming back on 2.0 and this new changed college football landscape, not necessarily even talking about an NIL, perspective, but a conference and playoff bracket perspective, what is Greg walking into, and what unique abilities or limitations does Greg possess to help Rutgers get to the next level in this new environment?
Yeah, I mean, basically that's the whole episode summary in one question. I'll try to take the high pointers first and get to some of the other parts later. But basically, in short, I mean, it's more paramount than ever that you've got a seat at the table. And there's an outside shot that, let's say Rutgers was in the Big 12 and they're going to get one team. I know it's random, but they've got plenty of other random former Big East foes in that conference right now. Let's say you're West Virginia. You're going to get one. You got to win your conference, and then you're probably in the 12-team playoff. Now, is that as good of a shot as Rutgers has coming as a team coming out of the Big Ten? I would say it's roughly equal. But bigger picture, by being in the Big Ten or the SEC, you've just got so much more TV revenue. Your TV contract alone, the media rights deal alone, is going to put you in another level of college football just by being in those two conferences. Big 12, give them credit, trying to survive. What became Pac-12 could not survive, right? ACC right now surviving. But if you want to ask me, like we talked a little about this during Rutgers win over all these ACC teams in a row, is like, would you rather be like maybe in third place in the ACC or where Rutgers is in the Big Ten? And it's hard for me to believe that you're not better off being in the Big Ten. You might have these like more pat on your back wins against, if NC State is having a tough year or whatever, but that's not the same level. And the TV revenues do represent that. Like, I do think that they reflect the level of quality because it's a pretty close to pure like capitalist, pure market like force as to what those values are. And so the people will tell you by what their choices are for watching the game, how they feel. Now, that being said, I think that the Rutgers being in the Big Ten overall good. Now, that brings you to the really interesting question about the exact realignment when it comes to the playoff, because the college football playoff didn't benefit any team more than it benefited Penn State. And that's because they had almost no shot. And I think they got one Big Ten title during this period, right? Of the non-12 team playoff, of the four team playoff, because they're always below Ohio State or Michigan. And, they're duking it out with Michigan State, Iowa at times, et cetera, maybe even Wisconsin for like who's that third, fourth team. But now, as a consistent second or third best team in the conference, like Penn State is always going to be considered one of the top 12 going into a season almost every year. So that by association is good for Rutgers, not because they're a quote rival. Though if they did become a rival, it would really, really, really help. Like people are talking about this year with the schedule, and you'll get more into that in a second. But let's say Rutgers goes 6-6. Let's say they even go 5-7, but they beat Penn State and knock Penn State out of the playoff. I mean, that's what rivalries are built on, moments like that. And so that ultimately, I think, potentially helps. And you're already seeing it. You saw it with Indiana last year. We were hoping Rutgers would have been the Indiana last year. But that fourth spot is sneaky, right? The chances of Oregon, Ohio State, Penn State, Michigan, the Big Four, all getting in the same year, usually one of them is going to have a bump in the road, which opens the door for somebody who has a slightly easier schedule, who has one or two big wins. Bada bing, bada boom, you're in the playoff. So ultimately, I think that matters. And the reason that matters, to answer your question in a bow, is that you can recruit players under the premise that they have a realistic chance of making the college football playoff. And there are those who can, and there are those who cannot. And right now, Rutgers is in the camp where there is a path. Indiana showed it to you last year. You're actually on a 3-game winning streak against Indiana. Like, it's there. Like, you could pull it off. Now, will they? We'll talk a little bit more about that in the context of this episode. But ultimately, the TV revenue and the fact that there is a path puts you in a spot that, only the teams that are currently in the Big Ten and SEC are really in there. And if you were not in that conference, you'd have to win the ACC. You'd have to be undefeated like Notre Dame outside of, an odd win against a directional Illinois and or winning the Big 12. Like maybe you sneak in another way, but those are really tough needles to thread when you're probably going to lose at least one game a year that you probably should win.
So essentially, Rutgers being in this, the Big Ten conference, which I don't think is news to anybody, but even the expanded college football playoff, being in that conference, it increases where the ceiling could be, right? It
Right.
gives them that opportunity, and it puts them in the in crowd where they potentially can have a very high ceiling because they've essentially got a seat at the table that makes them relevant. Not only in terms of knocking out relevant teams from the playoff, but in terms of, because the conference is as strong as it is, getting into the playoff based on where they stand in the Big Ten any given season, specifically tied to how the schedule plays out or whether they can get a big win against a team or et cetera. Now, my question to you is, and I know this is going to take us in a bunch of different directions, and I want to get there, but I think it's a two-parter. Number one, from your perspective, how realistic is it for Rutgers to have a ceiling that they're relevant to the college playoff in the sense that they sneak in every, so often and more frequently are just relevant because they're knocking off, playing spoiler, or figuring into some other team's route to the college football playoff? And two, how realistic is Rutgers going on a run in the college football playoff? And I know that that's tough because it encompasses recruiting and game day and all the other things we're talking about with Greg Schiano. But just from a broad-based perspective, what are the chances of Rutgers doing that, or what is the realistic expectation? And more encompassed within that, when you look at the Big Ten, give me a program, Dave. Give me a program in the Big Ten or in another conference that Rutgers should aspire to be or could be under a guy like Greg Schiano, given all we know about revenue, NIL, recruiting abilities, et cetera. I mean, can we realistically be Iowa? Does the branding go to a Wisconsin? Who do you see? What should our aspiration be? And within that aspiration, what's our aspiration overall with the college football playoff and being a perennial relevant team in college football?
All right, I'll take the first part first, I guess. And that is, I don't think Rutgers is in a position right now where it's all about the college football playoff. So I don't think they have to be in the college football playoff to continue to build. It's not like Iowa where, and we'll get back to Iowa in a second, but it's not like where they are right there. If the 12-team playoff existed 2 years ago, they're in it, right? Or Wisconsin was hovering around New Year's Six bowls over and over and over again, but they could never get into the 4-team playoff. So I think Rutgers has to get to that level, if assuming they could, before we really talk about how much does it matter. If they sneak in once in every 20 years, I think that's great, but they've got to get to a level for that. Second, though, is if they were to hypothetically get in, if there's one thing we know about this coaching staff, if they avoid teams that they have played, they are going to be more prepared than their opponents. So there is a chance that they could come in as a 11 seed, go on the road, and they're actually not worse on the road than they are at home over the Schiano era, oddly enough, against power teams. But you could go in and sneak a win or two, which would be the greatest thing that ever happened to Rutgers athletics. So I think that's possible. And we'll talk a little bit more about recruiting because obviously that's one of the pieces that has to get there. But to answer the second part of your question, I think this always comes back to me to within the Big Ten. You're talking about Wisconsin pre-dairy raid, so up to about 2 years ago, who had nothing going for their program prior to Barry Alvarez's arrival as their coach. And then all of a sudden, I don't say all of a sudden because there was a lot of work that went into it that you didn't realize until after the fact, they become a perennial, again, New Year's Six bowl team in the most recent incarnation. They were nothing before that. Iowa, historically, not a great team. Hayden Fry becomes coach, is there forever, and now Kirk Ferentz comes around, is around forever, and then you have this period of winning, and people think about Iowa as a program. That's, from a Big Ten perspective, I think that's where you want to be. Now, it's more likely that you could become a Northwestern where there's kind of peaks and valleys, or Indiana might even fall into that mold now where they were good with Michael Penix. He leaves, then they're bad. Again, Rutgers has beaten them 3 straight games. And then last year, new coaching staff, boom, they have this spike. So I think it's more likely Rutgers would be the former rather than the latter, which also might be equivalent to let's say a more modern day Michigan State, who right now they're down, but under D'Antonio and they were up, but John L. Smith they were down. They're a little bit more peaks and valleys, but I think Iowa, Wisconsin is somewhat reasonable. I think there's a couple reasons why that may be true or may not be true. And then from an SEC standpoint, the only one that really I think you can point to is maybe Arkansas. I mean, Missouri is kind of a weird one. Tennessee, I don't quite think Rutgers is at that level, and they don't obviously have the historical success of a Tennessee. But can you be better than Kentucky? Probably. And so Arkansas I point to because, yeah, they've had some times where they actually won the conference or been in big-time bowl games, but then they've also had times where, you lose to Rutgers back-to-back years. So
yeah, yes.
They're kind of all over the map. But I think you would sign up for that, whereas – ideally, you'd want to be a little bit more stable. Like in Iowa is probably where you would want to be most. But what do you think? Are there any schools that they should aspire to be like? Or even we talked about West Virginia. a little bit in the Big 12. Like, I think they can try to aspire to be a little bit better than that.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, what about, and I would take and sign up for an Iowa, Wisconsin level, or even a little more volatile like the Michigan State, type
Yeah.
thing. I think Indiana is really interesting because you point to two really explosive seasons. I think a lot of Rutgers fans would take either one of those explosive seasons,
Right.
especially if they were able to cap it off with some kind of bowl victory, be that in the college football playoff, at least one round, or another bowl. I think it'd be a heck of a memorable season and just really be enjoyable. I mean, if you think about 2006, it's really what it was. I mean, at the end of the day, we celebrate it like it was the second come, but that's what it was. I mean, right? So I would say, though, to shift to the Schiano conversation, you said we would be more like the latter. I mean, what traits as far as program building and consistency does he have to get us there? I would say that rather than the peaks, like extreme peaks and extreme valleys of somebody who catches lightning in a bottle with one player one time, or a schematic thing that people aren't ready for. I think it's more with Greg Schiano at this point and at this stage of his career, especially less like earlier in his career where maybe he caught them off with a little bit of a nuanced, defensive scheme that people weren't necessarily ready for, using speed in different places, or, special teams. I hope it continues to get back to where it was, where we are leading the nation in block kicks and things and putting emphasis, but more consistently. I think something about Greg that is a good thing is he seems to be, and we've talked about this before, and I've talked about it ad nauseum, putting emphasis on recruiting guys that are cultural fits and putting money and resources and effort into retaining those guys will lend itself to a more stable program that, while you may struggle to get those blue chip of the blue chip recruits that are going to put you over the edge of somebody like, the likes of which, Penn State, Ohio State, the top of the conference, we still have to get to even be able to compete with Wisconsin, which we weren't able to do last year. But that being said, I think there's his style, his ability to go out and understand the culture and build the culture will lend itself toward a more consistent and more level program. Now, we want that level program to be at the level of an Iowa or Wisconsin, as opposed to where we currently seem to be. Can he get to those heights? I think remains to be seen. I think the offensive has improved so much with the coaching staff. Now the defense might need to catch up and vice versa. So what are your thoughts on his what we've seen from him and what we could see from him, and your assessment of him relying on his skill set and his history to get us to be one of those schools that we aspire to?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a very open-ended question, so I'll just go with what comes to mind. So the first thing is, when you talk about consistency versus one of those kind of up and downs, I agree with you. I think they're going to be more the consistent type program. And the reason for that is, when you establish, culture might be the term overused, but a standard for how certain things need to be done, that will weed out some people who don't want to meet those standards already. So that's potentially good and bad, because there are some players who have the talent that they don't need to practice at that level to be able to perform on Saturdays. But those guys are the ones who kind of lead to peaks and valleys. And you see this in the professional ranks all the time, not just in football, but most commonly football and basketball. So you're kind of either weeding those guys out, or you're getting the best version of a guy like a Kenny Britt. Kenny Britt had character issues coming in. I don't even think he had any. Maybe he had one incident, even one after he left Rutgers in the NFL. And so people would dispute that on the message boards. How is this possible? And I think it's because there were so few Kenny Britts in the program, and everybody else was like meeting this particular standard of how to conduct themselves in practice, in the locker room, in the classroom, that you don't want to be that one guy kind of thing. And you can kind of rein in those type of players a little bit. Whereas Mel Tucker at Michigan State brings in a bunch of mercenaries. There is no single standard at Michigan State. They get one great year with Kenneth Walker, and then things just implode. I mean, Rutgers also, again, on a 2-game winning streak against Michigan State, a team who they had struggled mightily with up until Schiano returned. I don't think they beat them until 2020. So they had lost 6 straight, I guess, and then they beat them. And they've won 3 out of 5. And they were competitive in the one of the other ones. So like I think that's what kind of lends it to themselves. So now, okay, that's what you're shooting for. Why do you have these traits? One is I think that I think Schiano has a pretty good recognition of what players he needs for his system, not just character wise, but physical traits as well. And this is one of the things from the Belichick school of like, there's a certain height, a certain length that we need at this position. And so for Schiano, that's tall cornerbacks. Now you can get by with one, Christian Izzian as a safety. I know it's not a corner, or you can get by with one corner who's like a little bit more slight, but in your system you can only get by with one of them, and you've got to make sure that you're stockpiling in those areas. And so I think he's also ahead of the game when it comes to like NFL mindset for premium positions. What have we seen in the transfer portal this offseason? They're adding linemen, offensive linemen, defensive linemen. Just keep adding them. I mean, I know everyone's saying linebacker, 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 and truth will proof will be in the pudding this season if they do have sufficient linebacker depth. But I really don't see them getting two more linebackers, maybe one. But really, they're going for what NFL teams consider premium positions: cornerbacks, linemen, to some extent receivers, quarterback to the best you can in college, which is really hard because they'll leave if they can start elsewhere a lot of times. So I think it's the recognizing what personnel you need for your system, and that's why I would not say that Rutgers would be able to reach like a Ohio State Urban Meyer type thing, because they don't have the tradition, the money, whatever. But just from a pure on-field standpoint, there's only one coach I think that could win with any system, with any players, and that's Tom Landry in the NFL. Even Bill Belichick has shown some chinks in the armor that he can't win with just anybody in any system.
Oh, yeah.
And then, when you talk about coaches, we could have done a whole episode just talking about that. But I do think those are two things in terms of keeping a standard, knowing what you need to recruit. And then when you talk about recruit, it's not just players, it's coaches. And they say the measure of a true leader isn't how many followers they have, but how many other leaders they create. And Schiano has had a tremendous track record of growing coaches. And for that reason, I think that those would be the top three things that make me optimistic about that. Even as college football changes, these skills are becoming even more important than they were before. And those are the reasons for optimism that you asked for.
That makes a lot of sense. So I think I would agree with you overall that as a program builder, I just think, and I think we almost slipped into this, which was unexpected a little bit from my end even, but I shouldn't be surprised when I look back on the actual coaching philosophy, programming, branding philosophy of Coach Schiano. I think initially it was, well, that's going to hurt us with all the money and the transfers. He's somebody who recruits out of high school and builds. But actually, as a brand ambassador, as a good salesman, he's been able to go out there by most accounts, raise money, and still use that money and find creative ways to apply it to his philosophy of recruiting and retention, which for now is good. Now, you lose a guy like Motoré, which now the rumor is we didn't want to match the money. We could spend it on several other guys here. I don't know what the story is. We'll find it out at some point. I don't think he's going to be immune from attrition. It's just the new way that we are. But if he can plug holes and mostly keep the culture together, I think that's a reason for extreme optimism. And I'm not talking about being Ohio State. I think some people have crazy pipe dreams. I think it's getting to an Iowa level, Wisconsin level. If we can get there and continue to put the building blocks in place and continue to raise money, because it's going to be important.
Right.
But let's pivot now to, I think, what a lot of people have a concern about, which I think is evident somewhat, here and there. Last season, I think, and we've talked about this, I think it was a big missed opportunity to get us well on the way to getting to that level by going, 8-4 or better with a favorable schedule. And there were, I think, several games where we missed an opportunity. Namely, I'm going to relive it again. Once the season starts this year, I'll stop reliving it, maybe. But that Illinois game, that was, as far as I'm concerned, that was on coaching, and it was a bad game day decision. I know, and actually, I think in the presser, it got worse because instead of saying, look, it was heat of the moment, I was juggling a million things, I made a decision, it was a little, that wasn't what he said. What he said was, I have a set thing that I do no matter what the game dictates. And I was going to call a timeout in that position no matter what happened. So we did what we were going to do. I think that's worse than saying I was kind of in the heat of the moment, because now you're saying I have certain things I do and that's my philosophy and I'm not bending. And you saw in that game, I don't think it worked out. I also think going back earlier in the season, I understand guys develop over the course of a season. I understand you don't always know what you have, and sometimes injuries have to open that door. I mean, Bill Belichick had to open the door to Tom Brady because of that. I get that, but I think some of these receivers were ridiculously talented, and this quarterback was comfortable in this system. And I think we didn't open things up and change our philosophies until later in the year out of necessity, which I also think might show some issues with maybe stubbornness or sticking to a plan or sticking to a system, where I think in the program building aspect, it can be really a huge asset. I sometimes worry about the game day aspect, and there's been a lot of conversation in this community, even before the first time Schiano left, which is program builder, excellent, and having a high floor, excellent. But in terms of a high ceiling, when you get to the strategic decisions on game day, you get to even quarterback management. You had the whole stuff with Tom Savage and all these things. And he's been better, I think, with quarterback management. I'd say by a long shot now. I mean, you had Gavin Wimsatt who struggled, but there was he kept him in. He rolled with him for as long as he had him. In the offseason, he makes the change. And then Nathan comes in and he's grown and he's delegated better to his coaches. I'm great. It's great to see that. But speak about game day. And in conjunction with that, eventually you're going to have to, beat the teams you're supposed to beat on your schedule, a UCLA. And then the way the game went, Illinois was a toss-up. But at home with that situation, you probably should have won. And you're also going to have to occasionally take out a big boy in a big game to get us that's going to make your season better with overall record. B, that's going to give you that season that you need every now and then to be a Wisconsin or an Iowa. And C, it just increases the relevance and helps you build in every other aspect. I know the NewJersey.com guys have been talking about it. When are we going to get that splash victory? Can we win those games consistently with game day coaching? Tell me what you think about those concerns. Should we have them? Are they overblown based on history and everything else? What do you think about that aspect of them?
I mean, that's a very, very large pie. I guess from a macro level, let's just talk about self-scouting, because one of the things that we've touched on in a few other podcasts is like, if you're a prepared person, often that makes it harder to be reactive. I mean, I'm more in that camp, as is my wife, and so we need to. She likes that I can roll with scenarios, but I still prefer when I'm prepared. And so that's a tough balance to strike, number one. And then the other part when it comes to preparation is when I look at Kirk Ferentz, like he'll go into a season knowing at Iowa, like our offense stinks and we're going to need to, manage that appropriately, right? Like win games 13-9, 12-10, whatever it takes, which isn't fun. But I do think that Schiano he may not react right away to some of the things you're saying, but usually like within a half season, he has adjusted. To your point about the receivers, if that went to the end of the season, okay, that's a criticism that that's awful. But he did work with Soraka in season to fix it. And same thing with defense. Like they did kind of figure out like, okay, we got to play Keontae Hamilton at defensive end. Tough luck, guys trying to be drafted the NFL not as a defensive end, but this is what we got to do. So I think self-scouting, he has improved and he's gotten faster and faster and faster with that. But self-scouting also plays a factor when it comes to game days, right? Like if we look back at that Nebraska game last year, knowing what we know now, yeah, the fake field goal, like they clearly mistook how good their defense could actually stop Nebraska in that game. They thought they were going to need to score like 30 points to win.
And also,
it turned out they only needed 15.
Not to interject, but with the kicking game earlier in the year, just to point out, I thought that we had a pretty good kicker, but he was put in some rough positions early in the year. They wouldn't let him kick, field goals that he could make, and they were having him kick 50-plus yarders. Later in the year, they settled in. They let him kick the 30, 40 yarders, and he's hitting them. And continue, but I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, well, also earlier in the year, they were chucking the ball a lot against Virginia Tech early, and then they started running it a lot, and then they just kind of went into a shell.
Yeah.
Luckily, the screen pass to Ian Strong set up the game-winning field goal, but all this to say, I think when we talk about game day, yeah, there's a lot of head-scratching things, but there's also a lot of head-scratching things in every coach's game day resume. And when I look at Rutgers, just side comment that people have, sometimes you hear on NFL Network, for example, they say, well, was Vince Lombardi good at clock management? Well, we know he's a good game day coach because his team won a lot of games. They won a lot of close games. Was he actually really good at clock management? I don't know. For Bill Belichick, we have metrics about that. We can say, is Robert Saleh like the worst head coach in NFL history when it comes to like the last 4 minutes of halves? Probably. Pretty much we got data to back that up too. So like it's hard to say for sure. But when I look at the Schiano era, I think there's 4 just games that stand above the rest in terms of how important they were. The 2006 Louisville game, the 2006 West Virginia game, the 2007 USF game when they were ranked number 2, and the 2011 game against UConn that would have let Rutgers win the Big Ten title or at least share it. And the record in those games was 2-2. So I think a lot of it is just like in aggregate, yeah, there's mistakes, but the other teams make mistakes too. I mean, the unfortunate thing about the Illinois game last year is Bielema made the mistake of even sending the kicker out in the first place.
Yeah.
If they just sent the offense out and they converted 4th and 13, we wouldn't have been surprised because they were moving the ball at will. So that's what made that one extra frustrating was like basically both coaches made a mistake, and then it just so happened that Rutgers' mistake ended up biting them worse. But the other point I'll just wrap with that. I'll tell about the USF game. Rutgers beat the number 2 team in the nation in 2007. In that game, Rutgers survived, fumbling 2 punt returns, having 1 field goal blocked, and having Ray Rice fumble the ball with 4 minutes left when if they would have basically been setting up a 3rd and 2, which he probably would have got, and probably ran the clock out. So they survived all of those mistakes and they were still able to win. So sometimes we're a little bit too critical of some of these moments because nobody's perfect, right? Even in game. And I do think his record in those games is 2-2. But to your point, that Illinois game last year is like one step down from that. That's a ranked team. You haven't beat a ranked team in forever, since 2009, I believe it is. And eventually you got to get through there. And we talked a lot about this on Aaron's podcast on the Scarlet Faithful last year. Rutgers had so many monkeys to get off their back last year, and they got off about half. Yeah. Right? But it really would have been nice to get that one or get the Nebraska one because those mattered. I mean, losing to Kansas State in the bowl game, like I don't put as much stock in that. However, if they would have won and had 8 wins on the ledger, it would have made a difference.
Yes.
Whereas the Illinois game was like you're beating a ranked team, that's going to go in the record book. You're not going to hang a banner. But it's going to show like, hey, we won a big game. Now that also to set you up for the Citrus Bowl, which would give you another chance to win a big game. And so I think the problem is we're running out of time where we talk about a new coach has to like show they can get their vision is reality. Well, now we're getting to the point where it's like, okay, we've got to win a big game so that we can just knock that off the thing. Like Dean Smith, until Michael Jordan hit that shot in 1982, he was viewed as never winning a big game. But do people remember Dean Smith as never winning a big game? Now, no. But at the time, that was the knock. And so you've got to just get through that. And that's why that was such a missed opportunity. I actually re-listened to your rant after that game in preparation for this because I knew we were going to talk about game day. But I think we were too blinded by how many games we lost 50-0 in the Shea era, in the Ash era, that like we forget that a lot of these toss-up games are just that. And as long as you're not only going 3-7 in one-score games versus somewhere in that 40 to 60% range, I think that's passable. I do think that. Do I want Greg Schiano as like the guy making gut feel decisions at the end of a game? No, but I also think that he's more prepared to handle a lot of the situations. My one knock on it, just to relitigate this one last time, was if they would have lined up for a 75-yard field goal, would you have tried to ice him? Like, what was the line? What was the line on that?
Not in that weather. I mean, that's the thing. Not in that weather, I wouldn't. I mean,
Right.
I don't care if it was a 30-yarder. I just and look, I'm a fan. I'm not there, and that's why I would have appreciated. Hey, I don't know. I got caught up in the moment. I mean, it just seemed like given. Now look, maybe it would have been different had they been driving. It's fourth and inches. They're down at the 25. They decide to try to seal the game right there. Maybe you ice them because you're trying to knock them off kilter. The way the game had gone, they were knocked back twice, I think, on 2 consecutive plays.
Right. It was
The
4th
winds
and
finally-
13.
Yeah. So, but anyway, not to delve just into that game, but you made some comments that I think are interesting that I want to drill into. So essentially, I think what you're saying is, hey, we're 2-2 in those big games. A lot of it's chance. It's toss up. Can you really drill into Schiano when he's 2-2, he's 500 in those games. There were times when it went in our favor, times when it didn't. But then you said, is that the guy I definitely want with, 2 minutes left and it's a gut feeling using that? No. So I want you to get into, to the extent you can, like the specifics. Was there any tactical advantage or disadvantage in those 2-2 games to win, to not win? Was it all chance? And then also, are there games that aren't the pinnacle of the pinnacle big games, but that make a difference in the schedule where sometimes we're scratching our heads? Like, I know UCLA, we were beat up. We were coming off a crazy thing. They were super fast in the perimeter. We had a lot of injuries on defense. We didn't, I think the fans maybe didn't anticipate how much that speed would kill us. At the same time, UCLA's flying from the west to the east at a noon kickoff. They haven't been doing good. There's plenty of flaws. They weren't exploited. I mean, we don't talk about that game as much. Or you did reference Nebraska with the fake field goal. I mean, how many of those games that aren't necessarily those 2-2, 4 huge games, game day coaching still shows up? And what can we glean, if anything, about his pros and cons on game day that bode well, don't bode well, or we can say, hey, we're in the best position we're going to be in, the rest is chance? I mean, what's your take on that?
I think the more I looked at this when we were thinking about this in the offseason, the more a lot of this is chance, to be honest. And so one of the strengths of his is having mentally tough guys. I think that does help.
Mm-hmm.
But if we want to talk about like specifics, like I said, the question that I asked, which is maybe ridiculous, is like, well, how far of the kick would the guy have had to line up for you not to call a timeout? Because if you're saying that's what I always do, well, then what's the line there? Was it 60? If he came to the podium and said I would ice on under 60, I would have accepted that as an answer. But like, it didn't really make sense at the moment. That said, I also think it matters what you say behind closed doors. Like, was he like Coach Harasimiak, right? He gave him a lot of credit for the defense's resurgence. If that's the same messaging through the team and you're consistent, that's important. There's certain times you might lie to the media to protect your team, but most of the time you need to have the same messaging in and outside, which I think he generally does, which can't be said for every coach. Even an Urban Meyer wasn't even doing that, right? So I think that matters. But when it comes to like in game, let's say it this way. He's not Mario Cristobal, one of his pupils. Mario Cristobal has lost 2 games. 2 games because he did not properly calculate the clock to take a knee, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Rutgers is not doing that.
Right.
I mean, there was a couple key moments. I mean, I remember that when they had to properly run the clock out against Michigan State last year in 2023, they managed that magnificently. The clock management also again against Michigan State in the last half, the last 2 minutes of the first half this year. So I think that like those like bare minimum standards, those are non-question, right? Like we're not going to run out of time, those sorts of things. I think that the one that kind of irks me still, another Illinois game, 2020, when they were driving, and this was a one where I had to walk around the block for an hour and not talk to anybody. Rutgers was driving, tie game, field goal wins the game. Illinois has no passing game to speak of in that game. They're using like their third string quarterback who's really a wide receiver. And Isaiah Pacheco's running all over him. The thought from everyone was Rutgers did need to pass the ball one more time. But Noah Vedral threw a ball at seemingly like Shameen Jones, I think, slipped, pass intercepted, run back. Like the one time where I thought they didn't need to pass, they did pass and it backfired. But he was open, a good pass, and he's there. Like, I don't know if you can blame Schiano for that one. And because if you were too obvious and running all the time, then that also might backfire. So I've actually come to warm up a little bit on this. The more that I watch games, the more that I see it. But I do think like the main thing is you've got to not be in Mario Cristobal land or even Florida State land where then again, this is a borderline Illinois game last year when they were playing Jacksonville State. They're up by like 6 and they had to complete a Hail Mary and there was like nobody back. There was like 2 guys in single coverage. Like even the play that Illinois scored at the end of that game last year, there was, I mean, I guess it was single coverage because they went to zero blitz. I didn't love the call there. But other than that game, UCLA, close game, but that wasn't like a I don't think that game was lost because of in-game coaching. That game was lost pre-game, not dialing enough blitzes, having enough blitzes ready to go, and realizing like, hey, if we let this guy sit there, he's going to cut us up. Which is, I said that in the preview, and everyone thought that I would agree with me, and they didn't do that. Now, again, I'm not as smart as the Rutgers coaching staff, but that game was lost pre-game. That game wasn't lost by in-game decisions. And so when I look at let's say the 2.0 era, in their close games, they're roughly 50%, if not slightly better. When you do add it up, and I do have a chart for this that if we had a website, I would link it to. But like when they're close, they're roughly 50-50. And I think that that's good enough. Even though, like you said, I mean, that Illinois game is going to sting me until they like win a conference title, win a college football playoff game, at least beat a ranked team. Like that is just so inexcusable to me, but not surprising in a sense that like when you're a super prepared person, like you're going to go with your preparation. My only thing was like, how long of a field goal would have had to be? And then the other thing is like, I think sometimes the one knock I will also say is negative is like the emotional aspect. Having to send your defense back onto the field if they don't go for it. Clearly no one thought of that.
Right.
And I think that's a tough one because you say, I don't know how you could prepare mentally. You never really know how your team's going to respond exactly in that situation emotionally. But Rutgers looked, as soon as that zero blitz was like possibly picked up and Altmaier took an extra second on the snap count, we were all like, oh no. Like
especially
they recognized the zero blitz.
Yeah.
Boom. And so that kind of, I think he has a good feel for his team psychologically usually. But if anything, that might work counterintuitively in the end of a game because it's so crazy. And so that's a little bit of my concern is like, if we start getting in more of these UCLA type shootouts, Kansas State type shootouts, like, is that record going to stay 50-50 or is it going to start to go down because these other teams are just more equipped for a shootout? That's my question to you. Is it going to get worse in those type of games rather than your 17-13 slugfest?
Well, I think you bring up a lot of good points. And I think one, the emotional roller coaster that is a shootout or an unpredictable game, maybe somebody who could ride the waves a little better and ride by the seat of their pants might do better. Whereas somebody who's rigidly almost exceptionally prepared will not be as well equipped in those games as those slugfests where you kind of can implement your strategy slowly and carefully throughout the course of a game. But, you know, I was reminded when you were talking about this and how it kind of goes both ways of two specific things that I think might even change my perspective as we're talking through this. And especially as you tell me that it's 50-50, really close to 50-50.
In basically the number is like in games that were within 2 touchdowns in the fourth quarter, Rutgers is like around 50%.
Yeah.
And it's roughly that. I can look back the exact number, but go ahead.
I'll take that. I mean, especially with a program like Rutgers and where we are, but I think of 2 games. And the first one is the Nebraska loss last year where people absolutely were killing him over like not challenging or not speaking to there's a lot of speculation. Right. Did he even speak to them? He said they told me it wasn't going to change. So I actually think, because what you said that reminded me of this was that he knows the psychology of his team. And I love his message because I even use it in my day-to-day life about the greatest robbers are the past and the future. and you got to stay in the present. And quite frankly, that not challenge thing, whatever, it was like, punch it in. And I agreed with him, like whatever. I don't care if we got it, we didn't get it. We need to punch it in, and I agree with that. And the fact they didn't, that sucks. But like, punch it in. I agreed with him there. But another game that gets, because this is where he says you're going to go back and you're going to second guess no matter what we do. I do still think the Illinois game is a problem, but Michigan State 2 years ago, which, you want to talk about getting to another plateau, and I don't mean plateau in a negative, I mean in a positive, get to that another climbing step on the ladder. 2 seasons ago, winning that bowl game against Miami was a big step, and we didn't even have quarterback play like we did with Athan, and we could go debate like running, whatever. I'm not going to get into it. But Michigan State, I'm actually leaving because it's a freezing cold rain. I stayed most of the game. My girlfriend's just drenched. I had to get in the car. And I'm hearing that he's going to make Michigan State re-punt the ball as opposed to taking it. And I'm saying, what are you doing, Greg? Just take the ball. It was a decent field possession. Really think you're going to block? And what happens? We block the kick. We score a touchdown. We win the game. And so my point is, we have a tendency, because Rutgers hasn't quite gotten to the consistent pinnacle we'd like, I think, as fans, to look at the limitations of a coach and hone in on the non-successful game day in-game decisions that have been made. But to my point about big games versus games, I don't think anybody forgot about Michigan State. I mean, hey, that play is on the intro to this podcast, so I didn't.
Right.
But I think because it's not one of those big four you mentioned or whatever else, this 50-50 thing, I think, has a lot of legs, which you brought up, which is, we can hone in on games that we've lost due to what we ascertain to be, a lack of acumen in game day in-game coaching. But there are games where the in-game coaching and even maybe the pre-planned philosophies or whatever else have resulted in wins that have also been huge. We just might not place the emphasis on it because maybe it was a team that wasn't ranked, or maybe it wasn't for a seat in a bowl game or whatever else. But there might be a lot of legs from my perspective to what you're saying with this 50-50 thing. And perhaps there isn't some grand deficiency in Schiano's in-game coaching. Perhaps maybe he's not the best. And I'm not saying he is or isn't. I don't even know.
Right.
Maybe he's not the best.
It's even more advanced metrics.
Yeah.
Right.
Maybe it's not even that much. I mean, maybe sometimes his philosophies and intuition will get us to the promised land. Sometimes it won't. I remember a game a few years ago where he iced the guy like 2 or 3 times in a row on a field goal, and then he finally missed after making a bunch of the practice shots. So
right.
I guess while I would like a little more elasticity in situations like the Illinois game, maybe his planning and his decisions have resulted in just as many wins as maybe losses. So maybe there's too much emphasis on it. And with that being said, we touched on this program builder. We touched on this, ceiling of the program in terms of where we want to be. Is there anything else that you think we should address in terms of what the ceiling is, in terms of, is he going to be, is it him from a coaching standpoint? Is it him as a program manager? And then I want to ask you point blank, we talked about possible ceilings. What is your actual honest opinion about what the ceiling is under Greg Schiano? And with the caveat, do you think it's higher or lower without him? Because that's something we're missing. We could put the ceiling wherever we want with him. But, in order to think you could do better or do worse, you got to know, think about what the ceiling is for the program with or without him. So I want to know your answer to that question.
I think that, to wrap it back, in 1-score games since he's been back, they're 8-8.
Wow.
Now, if you go back to what I would call close-ish games where they were within 16 points in the second half, it's a little bit worse. But that's factoring in some games where they were, quote, within 16 points in the second half that, weren't really that close. Indiana 2020, they were down exactly 16 points, and they had all the laterals, and then that play was called back. I mean, I had that as a close-ish, but they were not the better team. They were not. No. They didn't outplay them, no. But, right, so, yeah. And then, of course, also in that 2020 season, they outcoached Purdue to win that game. So
Yes.
just for example,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
again, let me say it this way. With the college football playoff, the way that it is now with 12 teams, I think that your best bet is a coach like Greg Schiano for a program like Rutgers. If you're Michigan State, I could see you rolling the dice and trying to get another guy who might jumpstart. If and I think the funny thing is, Jonathan Smith, I think his name is, the coach of Michigan State. He used to coach at Oregon State. I think he's more of a Schiano type. I think long term he's actually going to be more of like a steadying type of guy. The coach at Indiana, his track record's too short. Like I don't
Mhm.
know if Cinetti is gonna, like, I don't know if that's gonna be a flash in the pan or if they can sustain success. I think they had a lot of smoke and mirrors that led to a lot of their wins. They had an easy schedule. I don't know if they can sustain it because just like we talked about with 2006, there was a natural crashing down. The following year, you're like 8-4 and you beat the number 2 team in the country, and like everyone's upset, right? Like if Indiana goes
Yes.
8-4 this year and they beat the number 2 team in the country, and everyone going to be upset?
Right.
Like it, right? Like it's entirely possible.
Mhm.
Now, of course, I'd feel a little bit better if Rutgers would have at least beat West Virginia and they went to
Well, yeah.
Big East title. Indiana's bought a little bit of currency, but remember, they're 4th place team in the conference.
Yeah.
It's just that 4 teams get in now.
Yes.
And so when I look at that, another data point that I like to talk about a lot, which people might have heard me on other podcasts or in my writings, historically, the gap between basically number 9 and 10, 11 ish, the gap between them and number 1 in overall recruiting talent, that gap is the same as the gap between 10 and 50. So if you can just be a team that is for sure in not in you don't want to be 50th every year, but if you're in the 30s, high 20s, you give yourself a shot to
Right.
be one of the like next tier teams that if you have a good year, you can end up in the college football playoff.
Right.
And again, I'm not saying that's what it's all about for Rutgers because I think they have to get to another level before we start acting like, oh, that's a big thing. But do I think Greg Schiano is going to make sure that they have recruiting classes that are in the 30s? Once in a while, you're going to be 20th. Once in a while, you might be 40 something. Even though if you look at his track record, there's almost no correlation between how good of a recruiting class is and how good those guys end up. It's actually kind of incredible when you look at
Right.
it. But
Right.
if you're in the 30s, at least you're in the conversation. And then if you're in there, and then you're in that gap between, like, again, the 10th and 50th best team, good year, good schedule, good development, couple breaks come your way, I think you're in there. So for me, with the 12 team playoff, I think that a Schiano type, and I'm not going to want to roll the dice and try to find another one of the same ilk, is the best thing for Rutgers in this era. Now, where can they realistically get to? I guess to wrap that point, if it was still only 4 teams in the college football playoff, I could see a reason to roll the dice. But with the 12 team playoff, I think this is what you want to do. So that leads to 2 natural questions. That one question you already asked, and one question which I'll mention. I'll ask you is, what do I really think the ceiling is? I think the ceiling is like in Iowa, because I think he's been there long enough. He has enough track record, and again, that team was not good before Hayden Fry took it at all. They went through the rebranding just like Wisconsin did with their block W helmet thing that a lot of high schools in New Jersey. We got a lot of W high schools.
Mhm.
My high school that we got Westwood, we got Weequahic, we got West Windsor, we got all these schools with a W,
Mhm.
right? And a lot of them kind of at some point had stolen that Wisconsin W. That was their rebranding. Iowa did the rebranding where they went to the Pittsburgh Steelers and said, "Hey, can we just design our uniforms with the same specs as yours, basically?"
Right.
So branding kind of went into it. So like all these little details, and I think ultimately that's where Rutgers can be. But to get there, first you got to be better than the Minnesotas of the world. You got to be at least on par with the Michigan States of the world and Illinois of the world. And that's just talking about Big Ten. I would say the equivalent of an Iowa in the modern day in the SEC might be like a Tennessee, right? They have a couple really good years, playoff expands. They're in it last year, but they'll have years where they're not where they want to be. I think you want to be better than an Arkansas. You might already be better than a Vanderbilt, even though they had a huge win last year, which has kind of sparked the debate about like big wins, how much do they matter? But ultimately, I think that is the ceiling for Rutgers under Greg Schiano. You could get, but then that leads to an interesting question. Could someone else maintain that or even make it higher? I don't know. I hope we're not having this conversation soon. But then it leads to a real, and I want to take your answer to that. But I want to ask you another question that may feed into your answer. That's if we're talking about Greg Schiano in a conventional head coaching sense. Teams now may start pivoting to more of their quote head coach is more of like a president of football operations type guy. And in that world, I think the ceiling can even be higher because then you might get the best of both worlds in terms of Schiano keeping the standard at a certain level, but then a lieutenant that becomes promoted to be head coach that isn't necessarily his boss, but he's this person's boss, but is actually your game day coach. That is a whole nother world. And that's what some people were kind of kicking the tires on 2 years ago about like, well, what if he just made Harasimiak the head coach and he was like the boss? And we've seen teams that have no head coach that are getting recruits to sign on signing day. So you can even sign players without a head coach these days. So, and it's kind of like the deep state in the government. Like, does it actually matter who the elected official is, or does it matter who's behind the scenes? I don't know. And that's where I kind of leave it with you is like, in what we understand college football to be today, I would say that their ceiling is like in Iowa. It's not a Penn State. It's not a Michigan. It's not an Ohio State. But that is good enough to get to the playoffs. And I think that that's good enough for me as a fan. But what do you think about it?
I think the ceiling is what you said. It's could be an Iowa, which I think is a perennial good team that is going to struggle to beat the big boys every year. And
Right.
I honestly, I wouldn't even, you made the remark, might roll the dice if the college football playoff was a 4 game. I still wouldn't roll the dice because to me, it expanded. That's great. Now you have a better shot at getting in. But I don't even think, from my perspective, I know a lot of people disagree, but it's kind of like whatever you make the parameters becomes the parameters, right? Which is
Right.
if you're an FCS team, well, you got to win that championship. But that's what there is. It's not the championship in the FBS level, but it's a championship. If they want to make it a 12 gamer and now, you got to be one of those 12 to win the national title, fine. It used to be 4, but then you could go to a different bowl game, a New Year's 6 bowl
Right.
or whatever, and win that. So I don't know that Rutgers is really ever going to have a realistic shot, even if they get in the playoff, of winning the playoff. So to me, that's not even figuring into my analysis. I think Schiano has got this program in a place where it's going to be stable. It's not going to be embarrassed. It's going to win enough games to make seasons enjoyable, to stay relevant, and to put us in position to have one of those years where we make just an awesome run. I think that's good enough for Rutgers, quite frankly, seeing as how the blue chips keep getting more powerful, the money keeps rolling in, all these other things. I think it's just pie in the sky to think you're going to bring somebody else in who's just going to magically get us over that hump. Now, I think it's feasible with lightning in a bottle schematically that you can just take people off kilter. But I think if you're talking about somebody to come in schematically and hit somebody in the face with something they've never seen before, or get lucky with a quarterback or something that just takes the world by storm. Well, with that coach, you're still looking at 1 year, maybe 2, because it's still going to catch up to them. Without the perennial war chest and all that, it's going to be difficult. So to me, I think he's the right person for the job as of now. I think our ceiling is winning some notable bowl games year in and year out, knocking off some big teams, sneaking into the college football playoff once every however many years and making a little bit of a run, or at least getting a first round victory. I think that would be great. I think that your second point about maybe like a football like chief of operations type with another head coach, I think that could be the best of both worlds. And I actually think that could eventually at some point be an ideal situation. I do think that the way Rutgers is, where they can barely hire, a president and then an AD, and then they're looking for a GM for basketball where it's desperately needed, not as much with football, to carve out like a salary for like a GM guy, head of operations, plus a head coach would be tough. I think it would have to be more like Wisconsin, where Schiano would have to graduate to AD with just heavy football emphasis, which I don't think is out of the question down the road, honestly. But it would have to be something like that, unless the money, which the money is a lot, but it would have to change bureaucratically. State would have to have a palette for it. I don't know. But I do think the ceiling is something that's acceptable to me. It's now a question of, if my ceiling is Iowa, if my ceiling is Michigan State, like, on a steadier, higher level, if my ceiling is Wisconsin, he's got to get there, right? That's like playing a golf handicap. You could have a much higher handicap than me, and I have a very, very high one. But I got to play up to my handicap at least. It could still be a bad day for me, even if it's not, a bad day for the worst golfer or a good day for a great golfer. And what I'm saying that is, I don't expect Schiano to be Ohio State. I don't expect us to get us to Penn State level. I don't expect them to get us, national titles. And that's fine. I'm not going to want to move on from somebody because they can't do something that I think the program is going to struggle to do with anybody. But I do want them to get to Iowa, to Wisconsin. I think the only time I would be questioning whether he's the right guy for the job is if he's falling short of his own ceiling, his own handicap. So if he doesn't get us eventually to one of those levels in a number of years, then I think it's time to look elsewhere. But for now, I'm happy with where we are. I think the ceiling is a fine one for me, and it's realistic. If I know there's fans out there that think that's not good enough because you got to win national titles, and we just disagree, and there's an impasse there in general. I think there's going to be an impasse with a lot of college football fans with respect to what they expect and get out of being a fan of a team. I just think that's a reality, but that's, everybody's entitled to their opinion. So that's my take on the ceiling.
So basically that kind of leaves me with 2 points that I wanted to make sure we talked about. One is, we didn't talk a lot about that 2010 season. Rutgers had a disaster 2010 season. That is a data point where they turned things back around after a player was injured. Obviously, in retrospect, you got a media coverage. I mean, obviously, Eric hopefully can just continue to regain movement. I know that's obviously really, really hard. But, I mean, they bounced back from that and righted the ship. So we're not talking about they need to be mid-90s Northwestern, like the worst team ever, to first place. Like, they're not even there. It's not that big of a jump to see that. I think that we have that data point. They can bounce back, which also should help people not feel like if they have one bad season, like if they have a bad season this year, especially against a tough schedule, that everybody panics, right? So that gives you a little bit more air cover. He has proven it before. And then the other thing, I want to go back to a comment you made on a previous podcast about 2006, just looking at the dudes on that team, right? And my dad made the same observation when we were talking about this. And when you watch Iowa play Rutgers, even last year, that's how you felt. It didn't seem like Rutgers had their big and strong dudes the same way that Iowa had. So even just getting to that gap seems like a reasonable goal, because it seems like they've been there before, where it's like you got these guys that look like they're chiseled out of granite, more than you already have. Like Rutgers has Tyreen Powell. That's great. They had Holland Pierce. That's great. Both those guys are gone. I don't know who else they have that's like an athletic specimen, like freak of nature type guy that you need some of them on your team. But ultimately, where we're going with this is we're going to pivot back into embracing the future of college football. And really, part 3 of that series is going to be, how do you get there? So it's a natural lead into the next one of that other series of podcasts coming out of this one. But that pretty much covered what I wanted to talk about today, which is the resiliency they have. They have shown a ceiling higher, I think, than where they are right now in terms of on-field results. Even if it's not winning the Big East title, I do think that the peak of that first era, we're still not quite there yet. So there's still a little bit of room to grow that's not breaking a ceiling that's never been seen before. But ultimately, to your point, like, how do you get there? And that's really what we're going to be talking about next.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with that. And you guys should tune in to part 3 of Embracing the Future of College Athletics, where we will be discussing those things. I think it's we've landed in a pretty good place, I think, with respect to the true ceiling under Coach Schiano. I'm comfortable with it. I can't wait to see it this year. I want to thank Mr. Anderson here for kind of coming up with that idea and working it the way he did. So we were able to bring that little mini series to you. We're going to finish out the other mini series, and we're going to have many more little series for you in the future. So we hope you enjoyed that content. If you haven't yet subscribed to this channel, click subscribe there. Remember, we're also available as an audio podcast anywhere you get your podcasts. And if you're listening in audio, come on over to YouTube, click subscribe. And also now we have memberships available. So if you want to sponsor the show a little bit, you can click join right here. There's some perks you get. I'm going to start a written column via email for certain channel members. So click that if you're so inclined and support the channel. Help us keep this beautiful light on here. But we will be back with David Anderson to discuss the future of college athletics. We'll be back with more content on both ends of that, with me, with him, with everybody. Make sure you're tuning into all your Rutgers content creators. Make sure you're keeping up to date with all the news about the Scarlet Knights. Until next time, Larry K. and David Anderson are out. See you later.